I had tried to be a novelist before really pursuing playwriting, and most of the books I wrote were terrible. And then I wrote one which I got a famous, it's unpublished. I got a famous critic named Helton Kramer to read, and he really loved it. And he actually gave me a letter saying this is a classic waiting to be recognized.
The first novel I wrote, I completely abandoned screenplays, and I just relish the idea of being able to go inside people's heads and describe things and all that stuff.
I was going to say I was just in Europe a few weeks ago, and we spent 10 days in Hungary and 4 days in Vienna. And Hungary still has some of the aspects of going to church, and they have a little bit more cohesion. The place looks better. It's kind of like Paris from maybe 1970s.
Even in the movies of it, there's a scene where the priest is looking at the at Gutenberg's press, which had just been invented around the time of that he set the story, and he's saying, "This will replace that," and he points to the church. That was Victor Hugo's concern, was that they were the carrier of stories.
I have actually an announcement which only my wife knows.
I'm Dr. Randy Bach. I'm honored today to have with us David Angsten and Jonathan Leaf, authors who have written on the topic of kind of LA noir, as well as maybe other things, multiple other things in each of their cases. And they're both friends of mine, and I thought we'd have them on together. I don't think they knew of each other, but there's certain overlaps, and maybe they can discuss their most recent books. We'll go alphabetically. We'll start with David, I guess. So, David, tell us a little about yourself and your latest book, The Medievalist, and how things came about, how you chose that kind of topic, and what's been the response.
Um, well, I've been in the film business. I was in the film business in Chicago, and came out here in '89, and kind of started over again. I had been doing documentaries and corporate films and commercials and that kind of stuff in Chicago. And I came out here and started working as my first jobs were as the person who writes coverage for scripts. You read scripts. Nobody wants to read scripts, so they farm them out to the, people, usually people just out of school. I was a bit older by the time I came out, but, and it's interesting because essentially it's the first gate you have to get through with a script. And here you are giving it to, somebody who's 20 years old, 21, 22. They're like, have enormous power and as to whether your script gets seen by anyone or not. So I did that for a while, and then I started working for producers, and I ended up at a company that has made a lot of features and so on, and I work with them mostly in development, working with the writers and so on. I had been writing scripts um, in Chicago, and I continued that here. That's mainly what I was doing, was writing scripts. And
Well, thank you, David. Hold on 1 second. So, sorry to interrupt there, Jonathan. You're obviously the other side of our country. You're on the East Coast. You had an LA concept as well. Both of you have LA noir books. City of Angles is yours, which I think when I interviewed you about it, I mistakenly said City of Angels. Google does the same thing, corrects my City of Angles to the City of Angels. And David wrote The Medievalist, and they're both captivating books. I recommend people go out and purchase them. They're great reads. So, Jonathan, tell us a little about your journey to LA Noir.
Well, before I do that, could I just put in another plug for your wonderful book about Zika, which really uncovered a great falsehood which is this Zika hysteria, which I think you demonstrated was largely invented, that there was, in fact, a pattern of people being infected by what was essentially a variant of dengue fever, but was not really a new ailment and certainly didn't produce this microcephaly that was claimed. So, anyway, just wanted to get that. I'm grateful to be here. And I read David's book and enjoyed it. I actually had a question for David I wanted to ask before talking a little about myself. I will do that. David, was this an idea? Was your book in part an idea for a screenplay? Because parts of it read almost like a teleplay or a screenplay.
I tend to write like it's a screenplay, and I deliberately did that with this.
Yeah,
I put it in present tense, and it's very much like watching a movie when you read it. I think, except that you can do all the things an author can. I mean, a novelist can, which is go inside people's heads, and which was very freeing when I first started writing novels after writing screenplays for years. Uh, and brings me to a question I want to ask you, which is,
yeah,
I thought, you worked as a dramatist for years
yeah,
and writing for theater, which is all dialogue. And then you wrote a
yeah.
novel where there's very little dialogue. I thought that was really interesting. I mean, I think it works great without it, but I was curious. I felt like you must have felt like I did. The first novel I wrote, I completely abandoned screenplays, and I just relish the idea of being able to go inside people's heads and describe things and all that stuff. And I just wondered if
Yeah,
you had a
I had tried.
similar.
I had tried to be a novelist before really pursuing playwriting, and most of the books I wrote were terrible. And then I wrote one which I got a famous. It's unpublished. I got a famous critic named Helton Kramer to read, and he really loved it. And he actually gave me a letter saying this is a classic waiting to be recognized, and comparing it to Portnoy's Complaint and Catcher in the Rye. And I showed it to people, and a lot of people thought I have a Gentile name, but I'm Jewish. They thought the book was kind of anti-Semitic, and they didn't really know how to interpret it. And I really wasn't aggressive about trying to sell it, which was a mistake. And then I started getting involved in writing plays and getting plays produced. And I put it aside, and I haven't really ever done anything with it. I also had misgivings about the book in some ways. It's a whole separate subject. But so I did have some experience trying to do it. And clearly there are people who can write novels as you did, which are really dialogue forward. This can sound like a very odd comparison. I don't know if you know the writer Ivy Compton Burnett, but she wrote novels that were to a large extent dialogue and that were very effective. And I thought your dialogue was very lively, and it really felt like it was written for actors, like for TV actors and maybe for a TV show. And you could see how it could be definitely adapted for a TV show, especially with the paintings and everything else. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, but that's not the approach I took because I wanted to move the. Well, you can tell you can. Let me qualify about what I was about to say. I was about to say it's hard to move a story along in terms of plot that rapidly with dialogue, but of course many people do, and you did.
Thank you. Yeah.
So Jonathan is kind of a great intellectual, and he's doing a series on intellectuals, as a matter of fact, philosophy, and is that's what how are you kind of wrapping up that foray?
I have no idea. I only started doing it because my publisher asked me to create a Substack to kind of build audience. I have a book. I have actually an announcement which only my wife knows, which is the first part of the announcement is not an announcement. I have a book coming out on October 14th about human evolution. The announcement is that I found out about 35 minutes ago that the first review came out from Publishers Weekly, and it was extremely positive. So when I get some time, probably on Monday, I'll send out lots of notices to people about that using this thing Substack. So that's really why I started doing the Substack. Also, that I thought a lot in philosophy was kind of pointless and stupid, and I'm a great believer in not entirely, but in empiricism. That we should look at uh, facts and evidence and historical record to interpret things. And philosophy often doesn't do that. In fact, it generally doesn't do that. Most philosophy has been based on what they call a priori thinking. You just come up with an idea and then you try to demonstrate it logically, which I think is not a very good way to come up with ideas. Um, uh, I, this is kind of getting away from the subject of these two LA Noir novels. Um, but about this book that I have coming out, a lot of it's about why people readily accept false ideas. And I argue that this reflects human evolution. It reflects our sociability and our need to be social and our need to cooperate. That's made us very different from, for instance, chimps and gorillas. And I hope people will take an interest in the book when it comes out. But in a sense, LA is kind of like the perfect example of this. In LA, everybody is kind of living an existence based on what everybody else thinks. Everybody's concerned with what everybody else thinks. And there's a huge element of fantasy and deception. And sometimes the deception is very open. It's interesting. David was saying that he'd written coverage for years. I've had friends who've told me, I've heard stories like this. People went into meetings with executives, and the executives said, I loved it. And then they literally were looking down and reading the coverage as the meeting was taking place. Now, then that they didn't actually read the script, but this is considered normal behavior. So it's indicative of you're living in a place where lying is just normal behavior and nobody thinks ill of it. It's kind of normal. David, you would confirm what I'm saying?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Um, I was thinking, you, your novel kind of explores Hollywood in depth through all these different characters. I mean, your subject is really Hollywood and the Hollywood psyche, I think. Uh, and I think you capture it absolutely perfectly. And it's kind of brilliant the way everybody in it is somehow connected to somebody else, and you see how they're all working their angle. And uh, my novel, uh, it originally came out of an idea that I had called Double Take, and it was about a woman who comes to her sister's apartment and finds that her sister has disappeared, and she kind of takes over her life and moves into the apartment and starts seeing what she was into and so on, and starts assuming her identity. Um, and that was I had on the shelf for a long time. They talk about how writers people come to you with ideas. Oh, I've got an idea for a novel. You'll never find a writer who doesn't have 100 ideas he wants to write. It's just a matter of finding time to write them. Uh, anyway, so uh, my novel is more Hollywood is more of a setting, and it's not the subject of the story, but it makes a great contrast with the central character, who is this medievalist scholar uh, and former friar and teacher of professor of art history. Um, and he's in LA, and it's a great contrast with all the self-centered, obsessed people around him who are in your book so well portrayed in your book.
Thank you. I
Um,
have a whole bunch of questions about that, if I may. So it was a little bit of an in joke that there's this serial killer and he's called the showrunner.
yeah, yeah,
Um, if people don't understand, a showrunner is an executive producer of a television show, the head writer of a television show. Um, so you've had the head writer of the television show, as it turns out to be, at least by nominally, is a serial killer and suspected of committing these crimes, but not actually the perpetrator. Is this Quasimodo-like character, though also a scholar? Um, Another question I had to ask you was, are you religious? Because one of the really interesting things you did was you contrasted this religious character with this entirely secular world.
yeah, exactly. That was intentional. My last book, I've written 3 books before this, a trilogy, and uh, each one kind of explored a different mythology or religion. And this was my chance to go back to Catholicism, which I grew up with. I had 8 years in a Catholic grammar school, and was indoctrinated into that. And then I drifted away from it and got into Buddhism and all these other things, which was very popular in the 70s and 80s and so on. It's still popular, but I find them kind of lacking. There's a kind of just a sort of a just wanting to see the positive of everything, the joy, and then ignoring all the dark aspects of the human mind and the human
Yeah.
person, which I think the Catholic Church deals with in such a spectacular way. I mean, just through centuries of working out these issues, and the scholars that have come through the church, and how the teachings have evolved, and so there's a very it's much more even-handed, and and it's much more truthful, I think. Um,
Speaking of
anyway,
showrunners, one of the I think everyone would acknowledge one of the best writers who's ever written for TV, David Chase, of course, was the showrunner for The Sopranos, and they did a documentary about him and about the show on HBO, which I saw. And he said a fascinating thing. He struggled with depression, and he went through psychotherapy, but he was raised Catholic, though his name is Chase. He's really Italian American, and
Cesare,
he's
David Cesare.
is that his real name?
is that
That's his
Yeah.
real name. Oh, I didn't know
Well,
that.
I think that's the family name. I don't know
Yeah.
who changed it, but it's Caesar with an E at the end. Cesare.
oh,
That's
Ah.
where they came with
Anyway,
Chase.
he he said that he was contrasting confession with psychotherapy, and he said in all the years that he went through psychotherapy, nobody ever said to him they never said to him any even once the action you're taking is wrong.
mm, exactly,
I
yes,
thought that was fascinating. I never heard that point made before. He said, psychotherapists, of course, they're being paid by you, so they don't want to, do something that's going to turn you away from them. But he said, you go in for a confession, and they're often telling you, don't do that. And he said,
yeah,
you don't get that message in psychotherapy. And he
well,
wasn't saying, he thought psychotherapy was worthless or hadn't been beneficial to him, but he was saying you got something out of confession that you simply didn't get from psychotherapy that was important.
Yeah. There's a famous bit by Bob Newhart, one of his like eponymous shows, I guess, where he's the psychotherapist, and a woman comes in and she's I don't know, got an obsession or whatever, and she's been to 1,000 therapists, and and he's like, don't do that. Basically, she's like, no, I want to talk about it. She's no, just don't do that. Anyway, he kind of berates her, and I think she stops doing it because he berates her. He's like, don't do that. Stop doing that. She wants to talk about the thing, and he just wants her to stop. Um,
Well,
it's
there obviously are psychotherapists who will do it. I mean, I once heard Dr. Ruth on a radio program. Uh, a man called up and he said, I dated this woman. We broke up, and I started seeing her daughter, and I think that we have a lot of chemistry. And Dr. Ruth just said, no. She did that. She said, no, you cannot see her daughter. Um, but obviously, this is a problem
was his
with.
name Alan Konigsberg? You know who Alan
Yes,
Konigsberg
I
is?
got that. I got that. Woody Allen. Yeah. No, but you know, there is this problem with psychotherapy, leaving aside that there's no spiritual dimension. Um, they have, there's no, first off, there's no Thomas Aquinas there giving you, an elaborate philosophical basis for determining whether your actions are good or evil. But there's also this further problem, which people in the secular society don't want to acknowledge, that you're paying the person to give you advice about how to go about your life. Well, that person has to spend a lot of their time telling you what you're doing is right. And I think it's actually notorious about this is a part of Hollywood I never saw. I did live in Los Angeles briefly. Um, but I never saw this part. But there's this whole phenomenon of like former rock stars or retired rock stars who live in Beverly Hills or Malibu or whatever, and they go to therapy 2 or 3 times a week, and they just talk about themselves. And you can't believe that any of these people are being told, you're wrong for leaving your third wife. You know, you shouldn't be having an affair with this 18-year-old groupie. Blah blah. I doubt they're ever hearing much of this.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, there's no sense of shame. There's no sense of guilt. It's like I remember a friend of mine who was going through psychotherapy, and one thing he came out with was no guilt, no guilt. You don't want to say that, and we've kind of lost it, um, and it's all, oh, that's the church, that's these obsessive priests and so on, and it's not. It's a necessary thing. I mean, uh, you know, I was thinking as you're talking about these characters of yours, they're all uh, they're all engaged in a kind of sin, which sin, if you define sin as a obsession, a kind of one-sidedness, a blindness, blind ambition. Uh, they rule out everything else. I mean, they let their families go to the wayside if it's in their pursuit of this one thing. And anyway, that's what I kept noticing
Yeah,
as you
yeah,
wrote.
no, it's interesting. When the reviews for the book came out, and they were very flattering, I'm grateful. But one thing that I heard, we saw repeatedly in reviews, including a not a less laudatory review in National Review, um, was people focused. One of the first scenes in the book, I think it's actually the second chapter. This young woman discovers a kind of classic noir trope. She discovers a dead body in her trunk, but she has this big audition for a film, so she decides, well, I've got to go in for the audition, and then I'll deal with the dead body. I'll call the police afterwards. And uh, a lot of reviewers really thought this was strange behavior, and they thought this was, like a very notable aspect of the novel. But anyone who's worked in the entertainment industry and lived in Los Angeles will tell you, no, 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 everybody would do that. I mean, 98% of people would do that. There's nothing abnormal about that.
Yeah,
That's what you're expected to do. Um, and actually, you think about it, there's
exactly.
really no. The guy's already dead. I mean, you're not going to bring him back to life.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
it's interesting. Reviewers who, many of them living in the heartland where are not so shameless. There's not such shameless ambition. Uh, they were like, "What? This is astonishing." Somebody said, "No, that's normal behavior in Los Angeles."
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I
yeah.
think
Nothing
actors
surprises me.
actors act. They take on a role, and they, you know, there may not be a there there. There's a Kurt Vonnegut story I love. I don't remember the name of it, but two young people, they meet in roles, and they're playing a play, and they fall in love because, let's say for argument's sake, they're kind of playing the Romeo and Juliet type role, whatever show it happens to be. It's not that, and they fall in love, and they have beautiful moments together, and they kind of cite their lines from the play when they're over dinner, and then the play ends, and they're just kind of like deflated. You know, those things in front of the car dealers. I'm going to they're just kind of like mentally deflated. They have nothing to say to each other, and then of course they just join another play. Um, but
Mhm.
there's this kind of aspect of whether there's any there in the Gertrude Steinian sense of are people they absorb their roles, and they've kind of fine tuned themselves to be these barometers of feelings, but are they able to process their own? Are they just Geiger counters, or do they have their own soul, their own mechanisms?
Well, I
Th-
think
th- th- yeah, their
Oh, sorry.
identity
Go
is
ahead. I'm sorry.
their identity is uh, almost entirely based on what other people think. I think you said something like that earlier, Jonathan.
Yeah, they. I mean, both David and I. I'm sure David maybe even more than I. But being in theater, we've known enormous numbers of actors, some of them quite well, and there's a huge range in the people who get into acting and why they get into acting and how serious they are about it. Um, you often find the people who are who are not that successful at it are often much more interesting people and less career oriented. Um, but there's a huge range, and so it's you have to be really careful to generalize. But I happen to think, by the way, I should just mention this before I quote Richard Burton. I happen to think Richard Burton is an unbelievably overrated actor. I do not think he was a good actor. I think he was a bad actor. He was a ham actor. He had many of the great qualities of a movie star. He was utterly compelling. He had this amazing voice. He was very charismatic, but I don't think he was a good actor. But he was a fascinating person. He said a lot of very quotable things, and one that I'm very fond of is he said, um, "What can you say about people whose nightly happiness depends upon the applause of total strangers?" Ratifying what David was just saying. So it's a very odd occupation, and even if people aren't that way when they first get involved with it, and sometimes people get involved with it simply because they're told they're attractive and they should act. Um, but the more you're involved with it, the more it genuinely becomes the focus of your interest and activities. And it's interesting to see sometimes, especially with actresses, they'll have kids and they'll realize they want to step back. But there are also people who they're chasing that success, that fame, throughout their lives, and it becomes pathological. I had a friend who was William Buckley's secretary. He was a former actor, and we were talking once about Loretta Swit. Um, did she die recently? I think she just died. Am I wrong?
Yes. Yes.
She was and he was saying that he was driving through North Carolina and he saw this dinner theater marquee, and it said Loretta Swit was performing. And I said, I was just astounded when he told me the story, and I said, she couldn't have been broke. You know how much money she must have made from MASH. That was one of the most successful TV shows of all time, and it was on for years and years and years. And he said, "Oh no, she didn't need the money. She needed the work." And the idea that after you've been on a show that was in people's living rooms, tens of millions of people's living rooms every week for 8 or 10 years, and then you want to act so much that you're doing dinner theater in a small town in North Carolina. It's hard for most people to get their heads around that, but it is true of some actors.
Yeah. So, what's the next step for each of you after a Los Angeles book? I mean, does it take anything out of you guys? How does it all play out?
David, do you want to go ahead?
Um, well, I'm supposed to be writing a sequel to what I just wrote, and it's sort of set up for a sequel. Um, and I just have to talk myself into it because it's there's a thing about writing. It's so totally absorbing when you're doing it. It's almost like the and I think you've heard other writers say this, but it's like the story you're writing is more real than your real life. It becomes a kind of hyper reality that you go into every day. Hopefully, it's the same for the reader. Um, but anyway, it is talk about one-sided obsessiveness. You kind of end up neglecting other parts of your life, and um, so I have nothing but admiration for and I'm friends with people on Facebook, writers on Facebook who are able to turn out a book a year or a book every 2 years, and they have a big readership and they do series. Man, I'm just my hat's off to them. It's just to me that's just amazing. I can't do that. So anyway, I'm trying to get myself up to diving into that world again. Um, while I mention that, I should mention uh, that hyper reality. I think that's how the medievals thought of the spiritual world. Uh, it was more real to them than the real world in a way. Uh, Everything was seen through that world. At least the people who, and most people were in the Middle Ages. I mean, part of the reason I got into I introduced the medieval idea was we live in such a divisive culture right now, And I sort of envy that, at least in Europe, there were plenty of wars and plenty of conflicts, but they had a basic value system of Christendom, basically. And I know I'm talking to two Jewish people here, but that probably are not that crazy about the history of Christianity. But at least it was a unified worldview, and so people could agree on basic things like chivalry and they knew what they honored and what they didn't. Um, anyway, I'm
Well,
rambling.
I mean, I was with a professor friend of mine the other day, and also of member of our tribe, my tribe, and he's calls himself like a kind of a Christianity tree hugger. He's totally involved with and enamored of Christianity. And I follow Andrew Klavan podcast and whatnot. And he started out, similar background to mine. New York City Jewish, and he's a Christian avowed. And I listen to his podcast once a week. So I have an affinity uh, for Christianity. I think there's been clearly, the greatest flowering of civilization under that aegis, to varying extents, varying places and whatnot. But places where they kind of lose, let go of the rope, are places that become dissolute. We see this a lot,
Mhm.
and I think we're seeing kind of maybe a veil of a dark age coming over Europe right now as it loses its faith. But I mean, I think arguably, I mean, it's one of those things. Kind of the question I wanted to before I got into this little dead end, as it were, is was the medievalist. Everyone talks about the Dark Ages. Were they dark? Um, what age was it, and how much did you have to tune into your own medievalist concepts to access his?
Uh, yeah, well, there was the Dark Ages, which was the period, but when the Roman Empire fell apart. But uh, I mean, it's basically a period of 1,000 years where it developed uh, the basic values of the culture today, um, and we're still clinging on to it. I mean, Will Durant had a line about uh, that Christianity, the 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 struggle. What did he say? The Christianity, the whole question of Christianity. Will it survive after Copernicus and Darwin? Uh, and he says that's been the basic drama, the basic human drama for the last 300 years, at least for the West. Uh, will it
You know,
survive?
you know. Oh, sorry.
Um,
You,
no, go
yeah,
ahead.
there's no question that you can't understand the rise of Western society without understanding Christianity. And the most valuable class I ever took was I went to a non-sectarian Christian high school. It was prep school, but they had required Bible study. And reading the Bible is so valuable. You really can't understand literature without understanding the Bible, and you can't understand the wars of religion without understanding the Bible. The conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, etc. And one of the unfortunate things about the way we run public schools today is that we don't teach kids the Bible. They don't know the Bible. But I heard a really interesting thing, sort of along these lines. I won't get into how this happened, but by chance, I wound up having lunch with, among other people, a well-known physicist who teaches at Berkeley, older guy named Richard Muller. I don't know if anybody have ever heard of him, but he's a well-known physicist and intellectual. And he said an interesting thing, which is not often said. He said, for most of Western history, you really can't talk about Christianity as a belief system. It was just the truth. Nobody talked about Christianity as, today we talk about belief systems. Oh, there's Buddhism and there's Islam and there's this and there's that. There was no belief system. This was a fact. That Christ lived and died, that he was part of the Trinity.
Jonathan is locking up on
Uh,
me. Is anybody else, Randy?
Yeah. Yep.
are you having trouble with my?
can you yeah, it's cutting in and out. Can you
Well, what I was
repeat
saying
what
was
you
that.
said, the
Are
last
you having
part?
trouble with? Can you hear me now? Oh yeah, now I'm having problems. Do you want me to maybe?
Jonathan, what are your thoughts on some of this aspect of Christianity and civilization?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question, but that you can't understand the rise of Western civilization without seeing the primary role that Christianity plays in this. Um, and a lot of its current problems have to do with the fall in belief. I went to a high school that had required Bible study, including studying the New Testament. I feel that I was very fortunate. I think it was the most valuable class I ever took because you can't really understand literature. You can't understand a lot of the basic issues in history, including the wars of religion and the Protestant Reformation, without a high degree of acquaintance with the Bible, particularly the New Testament. Um, and the fact that kids today in schools, they are not familiar with this is a gigantic problem, whether or not they're believers. But there's a second point, which I think a lot of people miss and which is not conveyed in most history books, which is something I'd never really thought too much about until I happened to be by chance at lunch with a well known physicist named Richard Muller. He's a professor at Berkeley, I think retired professor from Berkeley. And Richard said something really interesting. He said, when you talk about Christianity, people often talk about it as a belief system. Islam is a belief system, Buddhism is a belief system, Hinduism is a belief system. But he said for most of Western history, it was not a belief system, it was the truth. Just as I've known people have argued it, but water is wet. The sun shines at first in the east and it goes to the west. It was a fact that everyone accepted without question that Jesus lived and died, that he rose to heaven, that the Trinity is a real thing, and these were not subjects of dispute. So when we want to understand the past, we want to understand the Middle Ages, and I think getting back to the question you had, Randy, uh, that we distinguish, that period now is called late antiquity or the Dark Ages, from the period that most people refer to as the Middle Ages. This period of, Aquinas and so forth. Um, this is a period where nobody disputed that Christianity was true, who lived within Western society. I mean, for instance, there were Jews, but they had no significant role at that time in Western society. Everyone accepted as absolute fact Christianity was true, uh, and that this is no longer the case. This is a fundamental change. But we have to begin by saying, no, there wasn't a belief system Christianity. There was this fact of Christianity. And Christianity was the basic defining thing during the Middle Ages, the basic defining, and even into the, past the Renaissance, even into much, for many people, right into the Enlightenment, Christianity was the defining thing in their lives. So, especially in the Middle Ages, if you'd asked somebody where they lived and they lived in France, they would not have said France. They would have told you what parish they lived in. That was the defining. The church told them what time it was from the church bells. The church gave them their idea of right and wrong.
Mm.
The church represented almost all the people could read. So the church was really fundamental to Western society and the rise of Western society.
Yeah, Victor Hugo, with when he wrote The Hunchback of Notre Dame, I don't know if you've read it, but even in the movies of it, there's a scene where the priest is looking at Gutenberg's press, which had just been invented around the time that he set the story, and he's saying, "This will replace that," and he points to the church, to Notre Dame, and that was Victor Hugo's concern, was that uh, the church, and the church itself, the churches, the actual structures, they were the carrier of stories. They're filled with statues of the saints, paintings, all the stories that go with all those. It's an elaborate and long developed thing, and that's where people got their heard the sermons and the gospels and the stories. So everybody had the narrative. We were all in the same basic narrative. Um, and then came the printing press, and Victor Hugo saw that as what had sort of, well, it had democratized uh, the freedom of ideas, and it took away that authority that the church had always had, and he was concerned about that. But after he wrote that book, it was hugely popular, and uh, the they started Notre Dame. The church had been falling apart. It was kind of a mess, and they refurbished it and built it up to and kept it and uh, keep it as it is today. Why does everybody go to Europe? They go to look at the churches and the paintings and all this stuff from that period and from the Renaissance.
Yeah, I was
Right,
just
and,
in
and,
Vienna.
and we can't interpret. Yeah, we can't interpret those paintings without understanding them as as they were dealing with very fundamental aspects of people's lives. So all these stories, Judith and Holofernes or whatever it is, that these are fundamental stories in people's lives.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I was going to say I was just in Europe a few weeks ago, and we spent 10 days in Hungary and 4 days in Vienna. Um, and Hungary still has some of the aspects of going to church, and they have a little bit more cohesion. The place looks better. It's kind of like Paris from maybe 1970s. Um, there's parts of it that are kind of physically not as made up cleanly as Vienna is, but there's more integrity of what it is to be a citizen there than a lot of other places, which seem to have fallen into what I call Venice syndrome, which is kind of a Disney
Mm.
world aspect where you have the makings of a place, but they don't have the people. So people are visiting. There's more visitors than citizens. Um, but they on the other hand, in the Kunsthistorische Museum, whatever, the art history museum in Vienna, um, the level and array of religious expression was just, I mean, it's bottomless, it's unfathomable, and it's incredible. I mean, the type of artwork that is done all through the, you know, last, I don't know, 600 years or so. It's just, it boggles the mind. I mean, there's all different types of craft, and they're basically kind of expressions to God. They're people putting their lives and thoughts down in all manner of painting or sculpture, ceramics, and tapestries, and so forth. It seems to be very much the occupation, and it is kind of what people go to see. And I'm not an expert on this stuff, but the various regimes that were in Vienna, the Habsburgs, I mean, they represented the church, and they became part of the I guess the essence of the Holy Roman Empire, and the idea was to kind of carry on various legacies. I mean, it was Roman and holy at the same time, so they're kind of carrying on dual legacies, at least by name. And whereas you kind of see the pale reminders, somebody like King Charles, I saw it yesterday. It's a meme, but he's got blue hair and a keffiyeh, and that's kind of like what the king is. It's not really representative of the people. And I'll just kind of leave this one concept with an example a little bit further afield. I was watching an Instagram reel, and it's Yemen and Oman. And maybe the names have something to do with each other. It's probably the same name pronounced two different ways, Yemen and Oman. But it's basically the same people ethnically, and they're both on the bottom piece of the Arabian Peninsula, east for Oman and west for Yemen. And Oman, you don't hear much about, and it's like population is almost the same, and people are the same, and so forth. But they've been living under basically the good king. I can't remember the guy's name. It was an emir or sheikh or something like that. And Yemen is fractured like six different ways, and it's been mutating and reforming, and fracturing again. So we're the total upheaval and destruction and whatnot. But it's sort of like a heaven and hell kind of thing. Neither one is has what we consider constitutional representative democracy or whatever. They don't have these institutions and whatnot, but they do have kind of the good king and the bad king, and I think that's something that followed through in the essence of some of the leadership that happened, that people felt they were, I mean, there's divine rule. Nobody really wants that. But a lot of times the rulers took it upon themselves to be better than they were otherwise, to work up to the divine, and to work according to the teachings of the church and be good to their citizens and whatnot. And that's, something it seems like that's missing from a lot of more secular leaders we have, who kind of hate their population and don't want to embody it at all. I mean, look at Ireland and a lot of other places, which they seem to be on a momentum push to humiliate and debase and disappear their own peoples. I mean, it's just kind of a I don't know. This may be a little far afield from where we started, but I wonder if either you want to take up that mantle.
Well, just tangentially, I wanted to refer to something about that. It's something that neither David nor I really addressed directly in our books. Maybe David, in a way, addressed it in that his central character does some work as an Uber driver. But one of the peculiar things about Los Angeles, I only dealt with this tangentially, and I guess you could say he dealt with it, and that one of the characters is the Uber driver. Um, Los Angeles, in some ways, is a little like, I've never been there, a city like Johannesburg, South Africa, in that there's a very wealthy elite, and then there are a lot of people who are, I don't mean figuratively, but actually they're servants. If you come from a city like New York or Boston or Philadelphia and you spend time in LA, one of the things that startles you, maybe it doesn't startle you, but really forms an impression on you, which I think people in Los Angeles stop even thinking about. A huge proportion of the population of the city is composed of impoverished immigrants or their children.
Yeah, I
And
keep losing.
so people who really, well, just to refer to that in a way that's kind of tangential, neither David nor I really addressed this directly. His central character, Grimke, who's a fascinating, larger than life character, is an Uber driver. And I had secondary characters in my novel who were from Central America and were working as servants. But one of the peculiar things about LA, and I guess this relates to what you were talking about, comparing Budapest to a lot of cities in Western Europe now, is that there's an enormous difference um, between the people who have money in Los Angeles and the people who don't. There's enormous inequality, and much more than you would see in a city like New York or Boston or even San Francisco. There's a huge proportion of the city's population that's composed of recent immigrants, particularly from Central America, not necessarily Mexico, but Central America, and their children. And they work as servants. I don't mean figuratively, they literally work as servants. I've actually heard people compare the city in some ways to Johannesburg, South Africa, a place I have never been, but where you have this group of people who are accustomed, white people, in LA it's white and Asians, who are accustomed to having servants. One of the things that really startled me when I moved to LA was that people I knew who were actually white people who were struggling had servants. They had people picking their kids up from school. They had people coming in and doing their laundry. And it's because the difference between the income of middle class people or even lower middle class people and this new immigrant class is so large that you can employ people for very little money, whether it's as gardeners or as maids uh, or as Uber drivers, in a way that you can't in most other American cities. And so this, and it's very much a racial divide, though the servants are usually not black; they're usually Hispanic or something else. Uh, but it's a significant aspect of life there that I don't think people who don't live there fully appreciate, and I think people who have lived there for a long time have stopped noticing or thinking about.
Yeah, and there's a sort of a secondary tier to that, which is uh, talking about the film industry. There's all these people who want to be in the film industry, want to be, successful and recognized and have their work done and get roles and so on. I mean, for every actor that that you see on the screen, there are thousands who are trying to get to that position, and they're all working as waitresses or Uber drivers or whatever. It's a huge the wannabe class of the industry, uh, similar to what you're talking about.
Yeah, and a lot of them are exploited, and we see in the newspapers about sexual exploitation, but there are all sorts of other ways that people are exploited. So,
Oh yeah.
for instance, I met an actor recently who was he was the guy who read people. That's a term for when you audition people for a popular television show. I won't say which one it is, but it was on Showtime, and he did this for years, and they never paid him. They put him in minor roles in the show a couple times. I mean, they really exploited him.
Oh,
And there are other versions of this. A friend of mine who is a big time showrunner. He's a sitcom producer. He was a producer on one of the producers at one point, head writers for Cheers. He told me a story about another show he was working on. It was actually, no, actually, it was a friend of his writing partner told me the story that he happened to be going to the store and he was coming back to the office and he asked his assistant, "Do you want anything?" The guy said jokingly, "Well, a six pack." And he actually picked up a six pack and he brought it back. And he said the guy was in disbelief that his boss had actually brought him some beers. In most occupations, if your boss brought you some beers, you'd be like, "Well, that was a nice gesture. I mean, I should be appreciative." But in Hollywood, who does that? Nobody does that. People treat their assistants like dirt. It's just normal to mistreat
yes.
your assistants. They're grateful that at the end of the year they get the jacket with the little tag on it that says that you're working on the show.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of would push back a little bit on the word exploit. I think that's bandied about too much. I think these things are transactional. People, I think, implicitly understand that if they don't have the job and they want to get the job, they kind of have to hang around. I think we all go through various phases of having to cozy up to those who have something that we might want attention from or some position. I think real exploitation is chattel slavery. That's exploitation, and you may argue other aspects of that. Human trafficking and all that's kind of transborder stuff. But if they're indentured servants, I mean, I've heard of like Saudi families that have basically slaves and whatnot. They can't escape. But a lot of the things that happen in LA is transactional. You're not there. You want the role, so you're willing to do polish a few apples or hang around, and do things kind of on the make, on the take, whatever, kind of read scripts or whatever it happens to be to get your foot in the door. I am a first degree relative, I'm told, by my wife of my younger son, and he went to USC Film School, and he's a cartoonist and animator and whatnot. He actually said, "Dad, why did you let me do that? Why did you?" It's like, well, you didn't want to do anything else, like ever. That's all you ever wanted to do was cartoon and draw and write and come up with ideas. You should have like made me into whatever, a financial analyst or something like that. But so because he tried, his ideal was to kind of be Matt Groening, The Simpsons or something like that, and there aren't that many of them. It's like it's a very limited field, and so he went through that whole thing of reading scripts and working in the agencies and all that kind of stuff, um, and he's working on his own, whatever, freelancing, but he hasn't got a big piece of any pie. But I think along the way, I mean, I've met various of his roommates and friends and whatnot. They all do that stuff, and I don't think that's necessarily anything wrong with it. I think the apprentice model is not horrible. I mean, you come in, people now they have some concept of minimum wage, when they start, and I think that is a fallacy. For the most part, you don't necessarily deserve like $15 or $20 an hour when you get there. There's a certain amount of like getting acclimated before you're really worth more than what you're being paid. Anyway, that's a minor.
Let me just interject. I mean, to a large extent, I agree with you that we need to distinguish between chattel slavery and so-called Marxists use the term wage slavery, which is ridiculous because, of course, you can quit anytime you want. And yeah, I think the word exploit is overused. But the way that people first, the movie business in particular, and the music business even worse, does attract sociopathic personalities. They really take advantage of people. They're often cruel in their mistreatment. Let me just give you one story, and I'm sure David has 40 or 50 that are much worse. But I have a friend in Los Angeles he was a pretty important guy. Briefly, he was in charge of production for one of the parts of Miramax. So this is a guy who had some real, and he has some real credits. I mean, he has credits as executive producer on some successful movies. And he got hired by a startup movie studio, and the guy who was financing it said to him, and everybody was working for him one week. He said, "You're not getting your paychecks until you call X and Y people that I know you know. I'm not paying anybody until you do the following things. Your checks will not go through." They were regular employees, but he just thought this was a normal way of behaving. He said, unless you call, let's say it was Harvey Weinstein, unless you get Harvey Weinstein on the phone this week, your paycheck won't go through. That's just
Well,
not a normal way to treat people.
that's illegal. I mean, if they have a contract and that's not part of it,
Right, but
that's
no,
somebody
absolutely.
could.
And he had a contract, but that's the point. People will behave in cruel and unreasonable
Well,
ways.
if they can, we have kind of an in joke, my wife and I. The answer to any question, we do this over and over again. It's basically the dog. Why does a male dog, why does a dog sit in the corner and lick his paw? We'll call it, and the answer is because he can. You know, like if you could do that, you would. But you can't. So we have all kinds of things of issues. In the city council, and whatnot. Why did the city councilor make this particular ruling? Well, because she could. People do things to the realm and the extent to which they can. This concept of liberty is my ability to wave my arms around till it touches somebody's nose. Well, a lot of people don't really acknowledge that until they get pushback on having touched somebody's nose. So people do things. Why do the kids? Why is there wilding? What I'm sure it's called something else today. Why do kids do that in Central Park? Why did 15 kids beat up two people? Because they could, because they can get away with it. And when people stop getting away with things, then that happens. That kind of thing happens less. But people have this urge to be gods. I mean, the kind of difference between somebody devout and subsuming or sublimating his kind of personal self as God to some greater God is that you are a little bit more humble about it, and you're tends to be kind of equate with maturity and forward thinking. The real concept. I mean, I have a book ready to go, sort of, on narcotic addiction. And people talk about the disease of narcotic usage. I mean, everyone else does. I don't. I think if anything, it's usually it's a kind of a disease of lack of maturity. You're kind of missing this continuity aspect where and oftentimes the way out of the narcotic thing is to find God. Now, you may not know where to look, you may not have them, and so forth. But even if you go through the pretense of it, then you're much more likely to do it. I mean, in Judaism, there's like 613 rules. And what is it to be a Jew? I mean, I don't know precisely. I mean, we do it. I don't do all 613 by any means. But, this kind of the concept that if you do enough of these things, then you will be there because you're in the right place and you'll get visited by the right spirits if you're doing the right things that allow them to come in. But David has written, far more eloquently on this topic than I can speak on it. I also read your The Assassin Lotus, by the way, and these are these are kind of spiritual journeys and in a sense crime books, I guess. I don't remember the plot fully. I think it was in Samarkand or something like that. But what's the spirit for you? I guess that would be a question, David.
What's the spirit?
Yeah, I mean, what's the spirit you want, I guess, in your books, or how do you? Is it something you're dealing with in yourself that you're putting as a template in these books? Are you hoping people, go on a kind of a journey in your books that's not just about, finding the criminal or something like that?
Yeah, I told you earlier that I went to Catholic grammar school, and I I really pity people who haven't been through something like that because, I mean, despite the nuns and a lot of that stuff that I didn't like, uh, that it infuses you with this sense that there's a spiritual world and that you have a soul and that there's something beyond the material world. And you're surrounded by all that artwork and all that, and the church and so on. Um, so yeah, I've always had that sense, even in as I got into Buddhism and so on. I actually didn't get into Buddhism, but I do TM. I've been doing that since for 50 years. But I started with David Lynch. We used to go to the same place over here when I came out to LA, the same meditation place. Um, but anyway, it's a sense of you have to be able to transcend. You have to be able to transcend your situation, your life. You have to be able to look at yourself. I mean, that's what I think Jonathan and my novels are about. I mean, the people in his book don't look at themselves and ask themselves, what the fuck am I doing? Why am I doing this? Uh, whereas Roland, in my book, he's constantly examining himself. To me, that's the key thing of Christianity is examining, self-examination. Uh, uh, what are my motives? Why am I doing what I'm doing? And am I hurting somebody by doing it? And am I, you can look at it through the sins, whatever. Um, but I think that's basically what's missing. Everybody seems to hate Christianity because it's all about guilt and so on. And in a way, it is, but it is freeing in a way when you're able to uh, see your own motives and you're able to understand what's right and what's wrong, and you don't have to uh, fight it every time. You have to just sort of turn your back on it. Um, I'm not sure that I believe in the devil, but I believe in evil. And uh, there's a line about uh, from Wallace Stevens. He said, "The death of Satan was a tragedy for the imagination," and I think that's really true. It's such a useful idea. I think. Um,
Well, I think so
yeah,
many people in the intelligentsia today, they even have trouble with the concept of evil. They've been so persuaded by the idea that um, no one is really to blame for anything, that we all they've accepted philosophical concepts of causality so strongly that they're not willing to accept the idea that anyone is to blame for anything. I heard on Charlie Rose, this is many years ago, an interview with the guy who'd spoken at length, and he'd done a series of prison interviews, his own interviews, with John Wayne Gacy. And the guy, he was a New Yorker writer, and he began by saying, "I don't really know if I believe in evil, but." Then he said, "Well, maybe Gacy, what, he killed 30 people or something, was evil. Maybe. No, it's not maybe. There's no maybe there. You kill 30 people one by one and you hide them in your basement. You're
yeah,
evil. You're bad. That's really bad. That's not,
sure.
there's no maybe there."
Yes, they want to have a psychological explanation for everything, and there is psychology involved. But um, yesterday, I lost my temper with my wife, and you step out of yourself. It's something takes you over, and it's afterwards. It's embarrassing. I mean, it's pure nature, and it's not good. It's why Christianity uh, does what it does because it's able to channel, it's able to restrain us, uh, and I really think it's an interesting contrast between our two books because I think that's the essential element of it. We were talking earlier about being transactional, and the basic premises of our books are there's a transactional element. With mine, it's the art galleries and what goes on there. And with yours, it's just interpersonal transactions between people. Uh, anyway,
Yeah, and actually,
Yeah.
talking about that subject of evil, another quote that's kind of stayed with me. Is from a famous Christian, Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn said something in his memoir, "The Oak and the Calf," that's always stuck with me. He was saying that, and he was talking not only about communism but Nazism, obviously too. He said, "Evil is not something in any race or class; it's in every human heart." And I mean, by implication, he's also saying was in his own human heart. And I gather that he was repeatedly unfaithful to his wife, who sounds like she was a somewhat evil person. She was working for the KGB, reporting on him
Oh,
while his first wife while they were married. Um,
gee.
but he's saying something profound. We're all capable of evil. However, some people seem to have much more natural impulse towards it than others.
Mhm.
Um, and one of the good things about people, about humanity, about our species, is we have much less capacity for it than some other animals. Like I say, I have a book coming out. So shameless plug for my book coming out in October. Like chimps and gorillas, which are chimps in particular, are really sociopathic animals. And as we learn more and more about the brain, we realize that their brains really weren't constructed to feel empathy very much. And we do have that capacity, but we also have this great ability to be obedient and to follow
Mhm.
trends and to be preoccupied with status and
Mhm.
people liking ourselves. And this can get in the way of trying to do the right thing, obviously.
Mhm.
So that's really been great. I learned so much having you guys here. Let me see if I can pop your books up so people can find them. Um, and let's see. Uh, so we have Medievalist here. Um, this is David Angsten, and people can find it on Amazon, such as I did. Here we go. Paperback purchased. It doesn't acknowledge that I read the book, but in fact I did. And we have Jonathan Leaf's City of Angles, um, and they as well can find it on Amazon. And if people want to go hunt down my book, it's Overturning Zika, um, the pandemic that never was, and for the same price, you get a picture of me on the cover. Um, Looked better than that on certain days. Um, so thank you, gentlemen. Any parting words?
Thanks so much for having us on. And
Yeah, thank you,
we
Randy.
hope that we're carrying on. I think I can speak for David saying this. He will concur, I hope. I don't know. We're carrying on this tradition of LA Noir, which is an important literary tradition, that goes back to Raymond Chandler and
Mm.
Nathaniel West and many other people.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. If there's anybody still in LA who knows how to read, I I recommend they buy the book, each of the books, and they're great reads. I am somebody who's read them both. So thank you so much, gentlemen. I hope to have you on soon.
Thanks, Randy.